This is where it all restarted for me. This is one of the first records I found online after restarting my genealogical journey because we were now in the internet age, where I could easily find records like. At the time, I couldn't see an image of the record, just that it had been indexed. I had already accumulated loads of information from my previous forays into trying to understand the story of my family, but those had but it was very limited to times and places I could actually visit the research or from the information that had been passed along to me by family members. So in a way, it was like starting over. Anyways, I started searching online by searching for family members I knew, and I knew I might be able to find records for. So this record, or rather it was the index of a record, it was from my father's father, my paternal grandfather, and it was from January 10th, 1939. He landed in New York City. This puzzled me. I knew he was back in Canada by May of 1940 when he married my grandmother. So what was he doing in New York? Without physically seeing the record, it was something I would need to find out more about, as it left more questions needing answers. It was also another reminder of the closeness of Canada and the United States, and then often and easily people and goods used to pass across the border. How relationships between the two countries, whether business relationships, friendships, or actual family, are an important part of our shared history. And as with everything, it's an important part in understanding how we got here. And now in 2025, it's beginning to look like those relationships are dissolving on the political front. But my purpose of making this video is not to be a commentary on the current political climate, and as we find it, our two countries facing off in a political showdown and a potential trade war that could have a great effect on our future. No, my purpose is to take a few minutes to look back to the past, to the great shared history and heritage we have. I'm going to talk about it very generally while sharing some of my own family's relationships, which I was able to discover through my family history research, as well as some of my own recollections and insights from understanding and experiencing Canadian history. So to take you back and give you some background, I started my interest in genealogy back in about 1981 or 82. I was 12 or 11 and my mom had been given a paper copy of a family tree a relative had done on her father's family. I still have it. It's here in my binder of my grandfather's family. Anyways, here it is. It's a little tattered and from the love that I've shown it over the years. Anyways, I was fascinated by it. See, my middle name is Andrew, and I had inherited this from her father, my grandfather. And honestly, I loved him quite a bit. And I was so proud to bear his name. He had fought in World War II, and to me, he was the closest thing to a hero I had ever known. So one of the first things I did was I took up the family tree and I started counting all the other Andrews in the tree. I counted 14 at the time, with all the direct ancestors named Andrews, and then all the branches of cousins and second cousins, third cousins, etc. But believe it or not, back then I was a bit of a nerd. Okay, maybe I still am. But I had a fascination with history, particularly Canadian history. And with this family tree, I started to develop an interest in my own family history. Because after all, as much as Canadian history was mine to own and be proud of, how much more was my own family's history? It was particularly mine to take pride in and to want to share with others. So going back to this record, at the time, all I knew about it was the simple fact that on January 10th, 1939, my grandfather, Edmund Nash, landed in the port of New York City. It wasn't until I mentioned it to an uncle a couple years ago that I heard the full story. Though still vague, it was probably the fullest story I will ever get. My uncle remembered my grandfather talking about a visit to New York to seek medical treatment before he was married. You see, our Irish heritage left us with a fair complexion. And like many in our family, my grandfather at the time had been dealing with melanoma. So some relatives in New York had arranged for a specialist to see him. It's a reminder that even then our lives were intertwined with those south of the border. And when I was finally able to see the full record, that's what some of the notes scribbled on the bottom seemed to confirm. And I also recalled when I was younger that my father talking about a visit to an aunt, I believe he called her, in Brooklyn. He'd been in the Navy and they had made a stop there, and so he was visiting. And that was the first time that I ever heard of family in the U.S. on my father's side of the family. I didn't know where that aunt came from, and though I haven't really been able to confirm specifics, as I can't recall her name, I now have a better idea of where most likely that relationship and family came from. Now, on my mother's side, her father had 11 siblings, and post-World War II, 4 of his 7 sisters wound up living in what in Cape Breton is often called the Boston States. And I have many a cousin in New England as a result of it. And I've even been able to reach out and contact a few through genealogy sites. And I know many of you have similar stories where family connections reach across that border. And that brings me to the question I want to explore today. A question I'm directing particularly to my American cousins, but one that I think resonates with everyone watching. Can Canada and the United States ever truly be friends again? Because right now it feels like we're a family divided. We're in the midst of a trade war, and the one strong bond between our nations seems strained. But let's be honest, for many of us, the lines are blurred. We have cousins, aunts, uncles, and ancestors who lived, worked, and built their lives on both sides of the border. And that shared history, that shared family, is what I want to talk about. To my American cousins and to every viewer, I want to explore if we can find a path back to understanding. Now, before we dive into the history, a quick note, because I know some of you will want to correct me on this, but when I'm talking about Canada and Canadians before 1867, what I'm referring to is actually all of British North America and the people who lived here on land that would eventually become Canada. The story of Canada and its people is deeply intertwined with that of the United States. So let's take a look at our shared past and see if we can find a path back to our friendship. So let's take a step back in time to the very beginning of what would become Canada and the United States. Before there were 2 distinct nations, there were British colonies, all part of the same vast empire. And to my American cousins, I want you to remember that our ancestors in many cases lived side by side, sharing a common experience. One of the best examples of this early interconnectedness is the story of the New England planters. In the late 1760s, thousands of New Englanders seeking new opportunities migrated to Nova Scotia. They brought with them their traditions, their skills, and their families. They were in essence the forerunners of the many who would cross the border in later years. This movement highlights how fluid the boundaries were and how much we shared in those early days. But of course, that shared experience wouldn't last. The seeds of revolution were being sown in the southern colonies, and soon a great divide would emerge. The American Revolution was a pivotal moment, not just for the colonies that would become the United States, but for all of British North America. Now you might be wondering, was Nova Scotia invited to the Continental Congress? The answer is yes. But after some debate, Nova Scotia ultimately decided not to join the rebellion. This decision, while perhaps strategic at the time, set the stage for a different path for the northern colonies. It meant that families like yours and mine could find themselves on opposite sides of a growing divide. And for us as families, as historians, this is where things get really interesting and sometimes really complicated. The revolution wasn't just a political event, it was a deeply personal one. Families were split, loyalties were tested, and the seeds of 2 distinct nations were planted. Some chose to remain loyal to the crown, becoming United Empire loyalists who fled to what would become Canada, while others fought for independence. This is where many Canadians and American family trees diverge. But it's also where we find those fascinating connections that still bind us together. Even after the revolution, people continue to move back and forth across the border, seeking new opportunities or reconnecting with family. The flow of people never really truly stopped. So as we move forward, remember the story of Canada and the United States is a story of both separation and connection. It's a story that's written in our family histories, in the records we uncover, and in the lives of our ancestors. And to my American cousins, I hope you're starting to see how deeply intertwined our past truly is. The ink was barely dry on the treaties that ended the American Revolution when tensions between the newly formed United States and British North America began to simmer up once again. And this brings us to the War of 1812, a conflict that to my American cousins might seem like a footnote in your history books, but it was a defining moment for what would become Canada. Now I know that some of you are proud Canadians might be thinking, yeah, the Canadians burned down the White House. Well, that's a bit of a simplification. British forces, which included Canadian soldiers, did indeed march into Washington, D.C. and set fire to the presidential mansion. After they had dined on the remains of the meal that James and Dolly Madison had left after hastily fleeing that city. But it wasn't called the White House then. The name came later after the building was whitewashed to cover the smoke damage. Dolly Madison. I wonder if she served ice cream. It's interesting how ice cream chains on both sides of the border were named after important women that were important during the War of 1812. Anyways, that's just a coincidence, not really important to the story, but now I want to go get a scoop of mint chocolate ice cream. But the point is, this event and the War of 1812 as a whole underscores the complex and often contentious relationships between our two countries. For Canadians, the war is often seen as a victory, a moment when they successfully defended their territory against American expansionism. It fostered a sense of national identity and solidified the border that we know today. The decades following the War of 1812 were marked by continued growth and development in British North America, but also growing pains. This period saw the rebellions of 1837 and 1838 in Upper and Lower Canada. These were uprisings fueled by desire for more democratic and responsible government. And to my American cousins, it's important to acknowledge the role that some Americans played in these rebellions. Sympathizers crossed the border to support the rebels, driven by ideals of liberty and democracy. This involvement highlights the continued flow of people and ideas across the border and the influence American political thought had on the development of Canada. The rebellions, though ultimately suppressed, led to significant political reforms in British North America. They paved the way for responsible government and ultimately contributed to the movement towards Confederation. So as we look at this period, we see a continued push and pull between our two nations. Conflict, influence, and the ongoing movement of people shaping the destinies of both Canada and the United States. Now, in Nova Scotia, which at the time still included what was called New Brunswick, the transition to responsible government is often called a paper revolution because change came without violence. Through elections and parliamentary process, the transition to responsible government took place over 90 years, culminating in 1848 when responsible government moved power from officials who were appointed by and responsible to the British government and gave it to the people of Nova Scotia. It's the first time this happened in any of the British colonies. And like many Nova Scotians, it was around this period when my family on both parents' sides started to arrive in Nova Scotia. My mother's Scottish Presbyterian family was arriving as victims of the clearances in the early 1800s, and my father's Catholic Irish family arriving as indentured servants later as they fled the potato famine. As the mid-19th century unfolded, the paths of the United States and British North America began to diverge even more significantly. While the United States was consumed by a turmoil of its own civil war, the colonies to the north were moving towards a new union. Now, to my American cousins, you might be surprised to learn that the American Civil War had a profound impact on what would become Canada. While Canada remained officially neutral, the conflict cast a long shadow. Canadians were deeply divided in their sympathies, with some supporting the Union and others favoring the Confederacy. Beyond sympathies, there was also direct involvement. Many Canadians crossed the border to fight in the war on both sides of the conflict. This highlights once again interconnectedness of our populations, even during a time of great division. And it's a reminder that our family histories can often intersect with these major historical events in unexpected ways. Perhaps one of the most significant ways that the Civil War impacted British North America was through the Underground Railroad. Canada became a haven for thousands of enslaved African Americans seeking freedom. This movement of people not only changed the demographics of Canada, but also reinforced its image as a land of opportunity and refuge. As the Civil War drew to a close, the leaders of British North America were looking to the future. The war had exposed vulnerabilities and fueled fears of potential American expansionism. This fear, combined with other factors, ultimately led to the Confederation of Canada in 1867. My American cousins, it's important to understand that the creation of Canada was in part a response to the events unfolding south of the border. It was a way for the colonies to unite, strengthen themselves, and assert their own identity on the world stage. So while our paths diverged, the decisions made in both countries were often influenced by the actions of the other. In this period, we see the continued movement of people, the influence of more major historical events, and the shaping of distinct national identities. The Civil War and Confederation were pivotal moments that set the stage for the relationship between Canada and the United States in the decades to come. Now, I had mentioned earlier the relative that my grandfather and the relatives that my father later visited with in New York. So they were probably a result of a family event that happened between Confederation and the beginning of the 20th century. My father's great-grandfather, Patrick Nash, was married to Joanna White in 1870, but she died less than 4 years later after having bared my great-grandfather and a daughter as well. Widowed, Patrick remarried Susan Dempsey in 1879. They had 4 more children of their own, and in 1890, they immigrated to Suffolk County in Massachusetts. As a first-generation Irish Canadian, he probably found it easy to assimilate into this community of Irish immigrants, and it was a story passed down in the family that they were taken in by cousins, so he also had that connection there, though I haven't really been able to verify that. Anyways, this is where that aunt of my grandfather, who I believe was most likely maybe a grand aunt, or came from. It was, and this is where the family that my father visited while in the Navy in the 1960s came from as well. Again, showing that movement and connection between families on each side of the border lasted for decades, multiple generations. As we move into the 20th century, the relationship between Canada and the United States continues to evolve, marked by periods of close alliance and moments of distinct discord. And to my American cousins, I want to emphasize that this century truly shaped the dynamic we see today. Early in this century, even before the World Wars, there were trade disputes and economic tensions between our two countries. This is a reminder that even during times of relative peace, economic interests can create friction between nations, between friends. But these tensions were often overshadowed by larger global events. Both Canada and the United States played crucial roles in the 2 world wars. In World War I, Canada, as part of the British Empire, entered the conflict earlier than the United States. But when the U.S. did join the fight, our soldiers fought side by side, forging a bond in the trenches of Europe. This shared sacrifice laid the foundation for a closer alliance in decades to come. World War II further solidified this alliance. American forces fought together in Europe and in the Pacific, in the air and on the sea. The war effort led to increased economic and military cooperation, setting the stage for the Cold War era. Now, the Cold War brought new challenges and opportunities for cooperation. Canada and the United States worked together to defend North America against potential threats. Key examples of this is cooperation to include the building of the St. Lawrence Seaway, a joint infrastructure project that boosted trade and transportation. NORAD, that was the North American Aerospace Defense Command. It's a binational military alliance, and the DEW line, which stands for Distant Early Warning, is a network of stations across northern Canada and Alaska designed to detect Soviet bombers. And to my American cousins, these partnerships weren't just about governments and militaries. They fostered closer ties between our people. Trade flourished, travel between our countries became commonplace, and cultural exchange deepened. It was during this period that many families, including my own, established strong connections across the border. As I mentioned earlier, it's when my grandfather's sisters moved and started families of their own, leaving my mother's cousins and myself many branches of my family tree to explore in New England. And this was common experience for many Atlantic Canadians, highlighting the close familiar ties that existed. However, the 1960s and 70s also saw some strains in the relationship. While the alliance remained strong, Canada and the United States didn't always see eye to eye on every issue. For example, Canada refused to allow nuclear missiles to be stationed on its soil. And later, under Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, Canada's relationship with Cuba, particularly his close ties with Fidel Castro, caused some concern in the United States. But even during times of political disagreement, the bonds of friendship and cooperation often prevailed. A powerful example of this is the Canadian caper during the Iran hostage crisis. Now, this happened in a period when Pierre Trudeau was not in power. It was under Prime Minister Joe Clark, who was the Conservative Prime Minister, and his Foreign Affairs Minister, Flora MacDonald. The Canadian ambassador, Ken Taylor, he bravely sheltered 6 American diplomats and helped them escape the country. Now, this act of courage and friendship is a testament to the enduring bond between our nations. So the 20th century was a complex tapestry of alliance and discord. World wars and the Cold War brought us closer together, while political disagreements and economic tensions sometimes pulled us apart. But throughout it all, the connections between our people, the flow of trade, and the shared defense of our continent continued to shape our relationship. As we move into the late 20th century, economic cooperation became a cornerstone of that relationship between Canada and the United States. And to my American cousins, this period also saw some of the most significant changes in how we interact with each other. The relationship between Prime Minister Brian Mulroney and President Ronald Reagan was a prime example of this close cooperation. Their personal rapport and shared political ideology led to Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement in 1988. This agreement, which eliminated tariffs and other trade barriers between our two countries, had a profound impact on our economies. Now, this trade agreement was later expanded to include Mexico, becoming the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA as it's called. And in 1984, NAFTA further deepened the economic integration of our continent, creating one of the largest free trade zones in the world. Now, to my American cousins, NAFTA had a huge impact on our jobs and manufacturing in the United States and in Canada. However, as the 21st century began, changes were coming to the way we crossed the border. For much of our history, travel between Canada and the United States was relatively easy. But in the wake of 9/11 terrorist attacks, safety concerns led to stricter border controls. In January of 2007, a new requirement was introduced. Citizens of both countries now needed a passport to fly between Canada and the United States. And in June of 2009, this requirement was extended to those crossing the border by car. These changes, while necessary for security, had a significant impact on families and communities that straddled the border. And to my American cousins, to all the viewers, this was a huge change to the normal flow of people that existed for generations. Before 2007, if I wanted to go to the United States, all I had to do was declare that I was a Canadian citizen and have a driver's license that proved, or some other ID that proved that I lived in Canada. So this period of free trade and evolving border demonstrates how economic security considerations shaped our relationship. While we enjoyed unprecedented levels of economic cooperation, the need for increased security led to changes that affected the everyday lives of people on both sides of the border. And now, as we find ourselves in a challenging moment in the history of the relationship between Canada and the United States, with this new trade war to strain bonds of friendship and cooperation that have been built over generations. To my American cousins, I know it is a difficult time for many of you, just as it is for us here. The deteriorations under Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has left many wondering if we can ever return to a close partnership we once enjoyed. And it brings up a question that many family historians must be asking themselves. Will it take a change in leadership to restore the relationship, much like it was after the first Trudeau left office? But despite the current tensions, I believe there's reason for hope, because the bonds between our nations are not just political or economic, they are deeply personal. They are rooted in our shared history, in the lives of our ancestors, and the connections that still exist between our families. Remember the times when our leaders shared genuine friendship, when they could stand together and sing, celebrating the bond between our nations. Those moments remind us that reconciliation is possible and that we can overcome our differences and find common ground. To my American cousins and to all my viewers, I want to say that our shared history, our shared family ties, and our shared values are stronger than a temporary dispute. We must remember that every family has a story to tell, and every story is worth exploring. And if you want to tell your family story and you don't know where to start, I suggest clicking on the playlist right here. And if you just want to hear a story about some of those loyalists that came to Canada after the American Revolution, check out this video.